So, in light of Pelvic Pain Awareness Month, I'm just going to briefly touch on how the pelvic floor muscles come into our conversations when we are talking about pain and pelvic pain, and why the pelvic floor muscles are relevant and why potentially seeing a pelvic floor physio could be extremely beneficial. So, for example, when we injure our part of our body, if we were to sprain an ankle, there's a part in our brain which knows exactly where that injury has occurred, and it sends messages down to that part of our body from our brain and our spinal cord to say, hey, I've injured my ankle, I need to start healing this part of my body, and the tissues begin that healing process. Now, for our visceral structures, where we're talking about structures like our bladder, our vagina and our uterus, and our bowel, which are all situated in our pelvis and located just on top of this wonderful group of muscles called your pelvic floor, which sit from the pubic bone to the tailbone. When we have ladies who experience painful periods, if we think about an inflammatory response where essentially there's a form of inflammation occurring around those times in our cycles, around the uterine lining, around our ovaries, this whole visceral system, and our brain actually has no ability in a part called our homunculus to map these visceral organs. So what the brain has to do is, unlike the response it sends down to our ankle when we sprain our ankle, our brain knows we've experienced pain and inflammation around that time in our cycle and somewhere in our pelvis, but it has to respond by sending messages down to the nearest muscle group. So this is often why we can experience muscle pain around our abdominal wall, our lower back, and then our lovely pelvic floor muscles can come into play. Now, what happens is, as a protective mechanism, our pelvic floor muscles often go into that flight or fight response, because when we're in pain, everything sort of tightens up in that protective mechanism. And like a muscle in our neck, if we have a tight neck muscle, it can be really tender to touch, and it can be sore, and it can be painful. It can refer to other parts in our head and neck, like our headache. The same thing and the same patterns can occur with our pelvic floor. So if we have those pelvic floor muscles protecting our body every time we have a painful period, and they are referring to other parts of the pelvis, and they are becoming more and more tight and tender and sore, it can contribute to our experience of pain. So hopefully that explains a little bit about how the pelvic floor can come into our experience of pain and why it could be beneficial to work with a pelvic floor physio.